Burkina Faso had just dismantled a presidential coup, and not even a whisper warned the world it was coming. It didn't rise from a jungle hideout. There were no rebels in rags, no warlords shouting into radios. This time, the threat wore uniforms, saluted flags, and marched in step. And the puppet strings? They weren't pulled from the capital, but from distant shadows, far beyond the country's borders. Officials called it one of the most sophisticated coup plots they had ever faced. But who exactly moved against Captain Ibrahim Traore? And what truth did he unveil afterward? One so uncomfortable, so buried, that barely anyone dares to speak it aloud. The operation was timed for a Wednesday. Not a battle, not a bombardment. Just one quiet clinical act of aggression. One night, one location, one target. The presidential palace in Ouagadougou, the heart of power, the eye of the storm. Government sources later revealed it was supposed to be a full-force takeover executed with surgical precision. There was no noise in the planning, no grandstanding, no leaks, just a cold blueprint of decisive violence. Seize the palace, neutralize resistance, install new rulers before the city even woke. It wasn't the method that made this plot so terrifying. It was the mission behind it. This wasn't about ambition. It was annihilation. Not seizing control, but dismantling it. Burkina Faso Security Minister Mahamadou Sana didn't mince words. He called it a plan to unleash total chaos. Not as a metaphor, but as a strategy. Because chaos, when precisely targeted, can achieve what raw power cannot: collapse from within. The goal wasn't governance, it was rupture. The kind of rupture that opens the gates. That invites foreign boots, flags that don't bear local colors, peacekeepers who don't speak the language, the kind of intervention that doesn't ask permission. Intercepted intel showed the real objective wasn't leadership. It was disorder so deep, it would trigger foreign control. Not a coup, a calculated national breakdown. But who orchestrated this descent? Not guerrillas, not extremists in the hills. No, this came from within. From men who knew the scent of the corridors, who wore the same badges, who once stood in formation under the same sun. Some still received their paychecks. Others operated from exile, forgotten by the headlines but not by the systems they helped design. These weren't outsiders. They were ghosts in the system. Men who didn't need to storm the gates because they had keys. Men whose uniforms gave them access and whose absence raised no alarm. That's what made them lethal. They didn't shout, they whispered. And for months, maybe longer, they prepared. But this wasn't the kind of operation you map on screens or transmit through encrypted apps. No, they knew better. These were old-school tacticians. Orders passed from mouth to mouth. Routes memorized and never written. Notes destroyed as soon as they were read. A coup crafted not in rooms, but in silence. And it came terrifyingly close to working. So why didn't it? Whispers say the collapse began with a breath of warning, an anonymous call from beyond Burkina Faso's borders. No name, no location, just a signal, a fracture in the silence. From that sliver of intel, the machinery of state kicked into motion, fast, invisible, relentless. Agents cross-referenced flight paths, quietly flagged bank transactions, intercepted encrypted messages between military terminals and civilian phones. The signs were subtle. Too many officers suddenly on leave. A spike in code-scrambled chatter. An eerie pattern of ATM withdrawals from accounts tied to loyalists of a past regime. Then, a crack in the wall. An informant surfaced. One crucial detail: the date. With days left before the strike, the counter-operation ignited, but not in public. No announcements, no panic, no tanks on the streets. The response was as invisible as the threat itself. Intelligence officers crept through the system like phantoms. Phones were confiscated. Barracks were entered without warning. Data scrubbed before eyes could open. Some suspects were arrested mid-conversation, still talking as if the plan was in motion. But the game had shifted beneath their feet. Inside military circles, the air grew tight. The silence now buzzed. Suspicion bloomed like smoke. Schedules halted. Smiles faded. Every ranking officer began to wonder who was watching, who already knew. And yet, perhaps the strangest piece in this entire puzzle was the aftermath. No uprising, no bullets, no barricades, just quiet. As if the silence had consumed them all. As if they knew. It was already over. It was as if, in the very moment the plan unraveled, the conspirators felt the shift. Like a wind that suddenly dies mid-tempest. They didn't resist. They didn't run. They simply stopped. As if the loss wasn't unexpected, but understood. The silence that followed wasn't one of relief. It was something heavier, something colder. Because though the coup had failed, the minds behind it had not been captured. They were still out there, watching from the dark, marking time, waiting for silence to turn into opportunity again. And that's the most terrifying kind of coup. The one that never needs a second attempt. Because if it doesn't, it means the first was close enough to succeed. Too close. How close? Close enough that the elite presidential guard was placed under total lockdown without explanation. Close enough that President Ibrahim Traore himself had to vanish, to be secured in a classified location hours before arrests ever began. Close enough that, had the warning come even one day later, the red, green, and gold might not be flying over Ouagadougou. This wasn't the kind of amateur seizure of power that fades under pressure. It was precise, cold, methodical. A military-grade operation laced with strategic objectives and geopolitical reach. And the deeper investigators dug, the more tangled the roots became, extending beyond the capital, beyond the army, beyond the borders. The attempt was crushed. Barely. But the war behind it? That's only just begun. Now ask yourself, who had the power to set this in motion? Every conspiracy needs a hand to pull the trigger. But the real danger, always, waits behind the curtain. It doesn't shout. It calculates. It never gets close enough to bleed. And as Burkina Faso's investigators followed the embers of the failed coup, they stumbled into a revelation far more chilling than they had expected. The fingerprints didn't belong to desperate soldiers. They belonged to men who once sat side by side with today's power. Men who stood for the anthem. Men who wore the same ribbons. Men who once saluted Ibrahim Traore. This betrayal wasn't from the outside. It was born among brothers. One name echoed first, through hushed conversations in dimly lit barracks. A former colonel. A ghost. Vanished from the system 2 years ago after a quiet discharge that barely made a ripple. Not imprisoned, not hunted, just gone. But not forgotten. Because now he had resurfaced, not in Burkina Faso, but across the border, living in the cool shadow of the Ivory Coast. Not in hiding, in patience, waiting, plotting. But he wasn't alone. He belonged to something forming quietly on the edges of relevance. A cluster of ex-officers, dismissed and exiled, building what some analysts now call a shadow council. They had no ranks, no hierarchy. What bound them wasn't structure, it was motive. A shared hunger to reclaim what had been stripped from them. They knew the game. They had lived it. These weren't rebels. They were former architects of the system. Men who had memorized the turning of the locks and the timing of the guard rotations. They knew exactly where to insert pressure. Which officers could be bought with a briefcase? Which ones would bend under whispered promises of ideology? And unlike most enemies of the state, they had the one currency that matters more than guns. Credibility. Credibility grants you access. It lets you walk the halls unnoticed. It lets your words pass as gospel. But infiltration was just phase one. The real weapon wasn't muscle, it was doubt. Psychological subversion, planted like seeds and left to bloom. Intercepted documents show they reached out not to militias, but to elders, clerics, and traditional rulers. Not to build armies, but to fracture trust. They didn't ask for swords. They asked for silence, for rumor, for whispers that sounded like truth. They said Traoré was reckless, too young, too defiant, too quick to sever ties with the West. that he was leading the nation toward isolation. They didn't issue commands, they floated ideas. And ideas, when repeated, become belief. Divide the heart of the army, and the body cannot move. But this wasn't just internal sabotage. Evidence shows the operation reached further, through encrypted voice notes, through shadowed accounts linked to mobile numbers in Côte d'Ivoire, transfers, logistics, coded messages. Some hint even at the procurement of tactical support from networks outside Burkina Faso. Which forces a darker question: who financed this? Official lips remain sealed. But those who study military destabilization see the signs. The cost of such an operation: secure comms, cross-border travel, strategic bribes, points not just to domestic rage, but external backers. Not governments, perhaps, but private actors with power and motive. Individuals who look at the instability in the Sahel and don't see a crisis. They see a playground. For the ex-officers, this was never about a single leader. It wasn't about ideology. It was about relevance. They had once been the architects of control. They signed contracts. They moved pieces. They sat at the table where fates were decided. But after sweeping military reforms, they were erased. Now, they didn't just want a seat back, they wanted the room returned. That's why they didn't limit their movement to soldiers. They pulled in insurgents, tribal networks, political outcasts. They fused ideology with strategy, loyalty with ambition. They built a machine that didn't need a name or a symbol, just direction. And that direction was clear. Reverse everything Ibrahim Traore had built. Undo every reform. Dismantle every wall. One of the names captured during the covert sweep was spoken like a ghost story: Sadu. A call sign, nothing more. But behind it, a former tactical commander in the northern defense region. Sadu had gone dark months ago. No resignation, no trace, just silence. Until now. When a safe house was raided on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, he was there. Surrounded by radio devices, tactical maps, and, most dangerously, a list of active military personnel. Many of those names had already been contacted. Some had even pledged allegiance if the coup succeeded. It didn't. And now, the machine is broken, but not destroyed. The government won't say much, not publicly. But behind their silence lies a frantic effort to trace the web. Who else had been approached? Who kept quiet? Which generals still carry their secrets in locked drawers? What loyalties remain untested? Because the enemy wasn't coming. He was already inside. And if this coup was possible, crafted not with tanks, but with trust, how many more lie dormant? The architects of this plot didn't vanish into the jungle. They retreated to their sanctuaries, places where blueprints are drawn in whispers, where maps don't mark land but influence. And for these men, that sanctuary had a name: Côte d'Ivoire. You won't see it in headlines, but if you look close enough, you'll see the door is still open. There were no protests, no fiery statements on national television, not a single formal accusation echoed through diplomatic chambers. But in the carefully chosen words of Security Minister Mahamadou Ousana, the message was unmistakable. Every mind behind the coup, every last strategic brain, was not operating from within the country, but from Ivory Coast. And with that one revelation, a fault line quietly cracked beneath the surface of West Africa's already delicate unity. Ivory Coast, known for its cocoa, its peacekeeping diplomacy, its polished image of calm, was now being framed, not officially, but undeniably, as a breeding ground for insurgency. But this wasn't paranoia. It wasn't finger-pointing in desperation. It was a pattern, delicate, persistent, and deeply unsettling. A pattern built not on emotion, but on numbers, signals, and movement. Since 2023, Burkina Faso's security analysts had seen the outlines forming. Outlines of something far more orchestrated than exile. Former military officers quietly crossing into Ivorian territory and never coming back. Private homes in Abidjan welcoming unfamiliar visitors. Encrypted pings from satellite phones registered to shady coastal districts, These weren't the casual footprints of political refugees. These were the tracks of men preparing for something and doing so far from the battlefield. So why Ivory Coast? That question now hangs over the region like mist, too thick to ignore, too thin to grasp. Some say the answer lies in geography, a country stable enough to hide in, connected enough to operate from, a place with highways, foreign embassies, and just enough bureaucratic leniency to blur the lines between exile and covert activity. Others point to economic incentives, a history of hosting political elites, business exiles, NGO middlemen who move money without leaving fingerprints. A country doesn't have to raise a flag for rebellion. Sometimes all it has to do is stay silent. And Ivory Coast has done just that. No public rebuttal, no press conference, no investigation launched. Just silence. And in geopolitics, silence isn't always passive, it's often tactical. Especially when two of the coup's suspected masterminds, both ex-commanders from Burkina Faso's elite forces, were last seen in discreet compounds in Bouaké and Yamoussoukro, places just far enough from Abidjan to be forgotten by the media, but close enough to tap into the arteries of global networks. Enough space to plan, enough quiet to hide. Officially, there's no extradition treaty for military exiles accused of political conspiracy. Unofficially, the water is darker. Whispers are growing louder that certain Ivorian officials, perhaps not at the top but deep within the machinery, may have known exactly who was living on their soil and what they were plotting. Whether they supported it or simply allowed it is the question. But in this world, not acting can be more dangerous than taking sides. This isn't the first sign of tension between Ouagadougou and Abidjan. Since 2022, that relationship has been quietly fraying. As Burkina Faso's military leadership redrew its diplomatic priorities, leaning toward Mali and Niger, pulling back from colonial alliances, Ivory Coast stayed planted, neutral on paper. But neutrality, in African politics, is often a disguise for alignment, especially when one side is dismantling foreign ties and the other is holding tight. And some believe this isn't just about politics, it's about currency. Burkina Faso has pushed harder against the CFA franc, questioning its colonial foundations, hinting at new monetary paths. Ivory Coast, on the other hand, remains its strongest defender, a pillar of the currency union, and by extension, a guardian of an older system. Two worldviews, one border. And now, that border isn't just a dividing line, it's a front. Border intelligence paints a more troubling picture. In the 3 weeks before the failed coup, unregistered crossings surged. Individuals without official passports, using ID documents tied to international NGOs and civil society fronts, were flagged, but not intercepted. In hindsight, officials believe 6 of them were directly connected to the coup's planning and logistics. Not tourists, not civilians, operatives. So again, what did Ivory Coast know? And when? Burkina Faso hasn't made a formal accusation. It hasn't cut diplomatic ties. No ambassadors have been expelled. But behind the smiles, something's cracking. Intelligence sharing has slowed. Phone calls between high-level officials are going unanswered. The usual pageantry at border checkpoints has faded. The quiet is growing thicker. And the real fear? That Ivory Coast wasn't just a backdrop, but a blueprint. Because once a network finds shelter, it does what all living things do. It roots, it adapts, it grows. And if the architects of April's failed coup are left untouched, protected, or simply ignored, then the next operation might not fail at all. Burkina Faso is watching closely now. But it's not just watching movement, it's watching silence. Because silence, when left unbroken, becomes a signal. And the silence from Abidjan is no longer neutral. In the end, Burkina Faso didn't just survive a coup attempt. It survived a warning, a first strike in a deeper war. What unfolded in April 2025 wasn't just an attempt to remove Captain Ibrahim Traore. It was a test, a strategic, well-timed response to a larger threat, a reaction to a shifting center of gravity in West Africa. Whether he planned it or not, Traoré has pulled his nation out of orbit. out of the reach of those who once shaped its future like clay. And now, they want it back. Not the name, the structure, the influence, the access. Since 2022, every decision Traoré has made, every alliance, every rejection, has redrawn not just political maps, but ideological boundaries. He's broken patterns, challenged the script. France was told to leave. The game was changed. And for those who built their power on the rules of the old order, that change is a declaration of war. The echo was silenced, not by accident, not by oversight, but by design. What once echoed with the noise of Western boots, military advisors, and conditional aid now stood hollow. The corridors were cleared, the banners taken down. Western support wasn't lost, it was traded. Traded for sovereignty. Traded for something rawer, riskier, and far less forgiving, self-determination. And in that quiet, a new pact was sealed. Not with Paris, not with Washington, but with brothers who had also felt the cold edge of isolation. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, three nations led not by elections, but by insurgent conviction, formed the alliance of Sahel states, a triad not interested in playing by Africa's old rules. They weren't waiting for approval, they were rewriting the playbook. But power vacuums don't stay empty, not for long. As Ouagadougou began nationalizing its gold, tearing up predatory loans, and embracing a stance of non-alignment, a storm began to gather, not in the streets, but in the halls of power outside its borders. The world didn't call it punishment, it dressed it as concern. A concern wrapped in press releases, clothed in economic caution, and whispered through the channels of global diplomacy. But concern became containment. Aid pipelines were shut off. Development grants vanished mid-signature. International headlines filled with phrases like instability, autocracy, and democratic backsliding. Not because Burkina Faso was collapsing, but because it was refusing to kneel. And suddenly, the attempted coup didn't look like an isolated event. It looked familiar. A recurring scene played across the global south. A quiet script with an old rhythm. Reject the order, and the order will reject you. First come the sanctions, then the slander, then the shadows, foreign-funded media attacks, suspicious economic contractions, pressure from NGOs with vague mandates. And when the system is cornered, it sends its final answer. Regime change, packaged as restoration, dressed up in democratic concern. Burkina Faso's greatest threat doesn't move with rifles in the north, or generals in polished boots in the capital. Its threat is bigger, structural, systemic, global. Because Traoré's doctrine, messy, flawed, unrefined, dares to challenge a narrative. Not a law, not a trade deal, a narrative. The one that says Africa is broken and must be fixed from the outside. The one that says real sovereignty is dangerous unless it's approved. That independence is only valid when it's stamped by Washington or signed off by Paris. That a nation must always choose a master, but never itself. Burkina Faso refused, and in doing so, it didn't just rebel, it humiliated those who wrote the script. It proved the system wasn't universal, it was fragile. And now that system, bruised and disrespected, is striking back. You can feel it in the security alerts suddenly popping up in embassy feeds, in the analyst reports predicting doom, in the sudden travel bans justified by threats that long predated Traoré. Every headline, every whisper, every strategic silence is a piece of the same weapon: delegitimization. But here's the twist. The more they try to break Burkina Faso, the more unshaken it stands. And the firmer it stands, the more eyes begin to turn, not just from Mali or Niger, but from Ghana, Chad, Guinea, and beyond. A question now moves through the dust of the continent like a pulse. What if Burkina Faso isn't the problem? What if it's the blueprint? A blueprint of resistance, of resource control, of saying no to foreign hands and yes to national hands. A model that doesn't beg to be rescued, but dares to walk alone. That's what makes Ibrahim Traore dangerous. Not his charisma, not his uniform, but his survival. Because survival in defiance is contagious. And if one nation can say no and still stand, then maybe others can too. This isn't just a coup that failed. It's a story that almost got rewritten. And the war that follows won't be fought with tanks. It will be fought with narratives. A war between nations reclaiming their voice, and a global empire that believes it still owns the microphone. This empire doesn't invade with troops anymore. It invades with summits, with funding arrangements, with democracy lectures wrapped in velvet threats. It doesn't storm borders. It chooses who gets to lead and who doesn't. Quietly, persistently, relentlessly. April 2025 was meant to be a correction, a warning, a recalibration. But something happened that wasn't supposed to happen. Burkina Faso said no. Not this time. Not again. And now, the question the world must ask is no longer why did the coup happen? It's what if it had succeeded? Because this wasn't just about removing a man. It was about removing a movement. And that movement isn't finished. It's watching. It's growing. And it's being heard. Do you believe the world should be paying more attention? Why do you think these coups repeat again and again? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And if you're hungry for untold truths about Black history, Black power, and the civilizations no one dares to teach you, subscribe now and tap that bell. We're not just telling stories. We're exposing the ones you were never meant to hear. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay awake.